So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another faction showcase, and today we'll be looking at the much requested Gondor, and this is one that I've been meaning to get around to for quite some time now, and now I finally have the opportunity to do so. And obviously they do have quite a few infantry options to the point where I cannot actually combine them with all their siege, so let's get right to it. Naturally, you know, I've said in the past that Gondor do have quite a lot in common with the dwarves, weirdly enough, in terms of their infantry focus, but starting off with the civilians, which are kind of they're obviously a nothing unit, really. Like, you can put your general in them if you want to get a little bit creative, and they do have this sort of loose formation effect, and they naturally cost next to nothing. They only cost 150, so they are, I think, the cheapest unit that the humans on the good side of Middle-earth can bring at any rate. But there's really not much to say about the civilians other than their combat stats are obviously woefully low. But they do have a decent unit count, I suppose, at 200, so if you need some cheap cannon fodder, then you can bring your farmers to the battlefield. But getting on to the genuine militia units that Gondor have available to them, starting off with the Ramessekor garrison, which are a bit of a departure actually from the regular militia units you'll see from the Kingdoms of Men, because they are a swordsman unit, which means they are obviously a little bit more effective against other infantry units than they are at warding off cavalry, which is interesting considering Gondor in other places of their army are much more polearm focused than your average Kingdom of Men. And actually, if you have a look over here, they also have an upgrade model, I believe, which gives some of their unit models a little bit more chainmail around their armour, which is quite interesting. If you have a look, yeah, the armour value may only increase the defence by 1, but it is more like an increase of 2 when you look at it in real terms and how effectiveness sort of gets measured. But the Ramessekor garrison are pretty decent at this. If you want to sort of pack your front line with a unit which is difficult to hack your way through, and pretty decent in combat against other low tier units, then the Ramessekor garrison might be right up your alley, particularly against the very low tier orcs. They can prove to be pretty cost effective, honestly. If you have a look at their attack, it's obviously very low, at only 3, and it's not armor piercing either, so they do have that working against them. But their overall defense values, this is the upgraded armor variant, but even so, a total defense usually of 15 is pretty damn good for only a recruitment cost of 350. Meanwhile, if we move backwards into the main line of Gondor, we of course, first of all, we'll have the Gondor infantry, which is over on this flank over here. And this is the standard variant with just the basic mail armor. So if you have a look at their stats, again, they have slightly better stats all around than the Ramessekor garrison, as you might expect. You know, this is obviously the main line of Gondor. They only cost 550, and they are potentially one of the most cost-efficient front lines in the game. They are obviously very defensive in nature as a faction, Gondor, and the Gondor infantry are no exception to that. They're much better used when they are sort of blocking the enemy infantry's advance in their formation, and they too have armor upgrades, although the feature of most of the Gondorian infantry, as you can see from the bottom here, is that several of their mainline units, their sort of basic units, which your army is going to be, the majority of your army is going to be made up of this kind of unit, you can upgrade their armor twice. So here you can see the first upgrade where they get some more shoulder armor, and then finally over here we have the full plate variant, which is of course the most iconic of all of the Gondorian looks. And when they have full plate, they are exceptionally difficult to cut their way through unless you have AP. So with factions with limited AP options may have a really tough time against Gondor's front line, because it's so cost effective. You know, the equivalent dwarven units would run you more in terms of the gold to effectiveness ratio, and I really like the Gondor infantry, but this does come with the same caveat as the Uruk-hai infantry in the previous showcase, in that if you're up against a faction with a good amount of AP options, then you may just want to leave the armor upgrades at home and go for the cheaper variant instead, or even go for different units entirely. But even so, a very, very sturdy frontline unit indeed. And the same principle applies to the Gondorian spearmen, of course, who, you know, it depends really on what faction you're facing, whether or not you want the vast majority of your front line to be spears or infantry. Obviously the spears have got a malus fighting against other infantry, but they do have higher mass, and they can of course form shield wall, and they have that bonus against cavalry. So it really is dependent on what you want to do. Here we can see the basic mail variant, and then we go on to the other variant with the shoulder pauldrons and slightly heavier armour all round, before we finally move into the full plate variant, which is of course very difficult to bring down indeed. And obviously it's worth saying as well that decent shield values across the board, so very, very difficult to skirmish down the Gondorian front line. They're going to be able to withstand that sort of pressure for quite some time. But both of these units are very defensive in nature, and neither of them really have fantastic attack values, but that is where the first of the sort of genuinely attacking Gondorian units comes in. Arguably the only one they have in their roster, which is the Axemen of Lassarnak, which is of course a two-handed axe shock unit, which is effective against armour, but even here you can see that their total defence is higher than their total attack, and this is really a feature which runs throughout the Gondorian roster. Their defence values are very high. They are based very much around keeping their own troops alive and outlasting the enemy, even with shock units like this. And this of course makes a great deal of sense when you consider their geographical position right in front of Mordor. Every soldier counts and you can't afford to lose them. But of course the effectiveness against armour is the main draw of bringing a two-handed axe unit. Their defensive skill is not particularly high, it's mostly in their armour where they are sort of most at home, and obviously they have no shield, so they will still be very vulnerable to arrows, unlike the shielded infantry we've seen before. But they also have 2 levels of armour upgrade, I believe. This is the first of them. So you can see, I think this uses elements from the Lasarnak Nobles model from Moss, in addition to some of the standard Gondorian armour. You can see this is a big jump from the standard Axemen of Lasarnak, and then we move on to the even heavier armoured version, which have sort of emblems on their chests more often than not. And of course this is a this was previously the Lasarnak Nobles model when it was its own unit within Gondor. And of course this makes them very, very tough indeed to break down, because this will give them a total armour value of 9. It dramatically increases their defence. So if you feel as though you want to be more aggressive with Gondor, which is possible against certain factions, particularly against more heavily armoured groups, then the Axemen of Lasarnak can serve you very well. Now the only sort of more basic unit in terms of their cost at any rate that can be afforded by Gondor to make up the bulk of their main line are going to be the Guards of Osgiliath. In terms of the, well, they have a total cost of 650. You cannot upgrade the armour on these guys though, which is what I've been trying to spit out. All of the other units you can see on the Gondorian main line you can upgrade to silver shields, but the Guards of Osgiliath you cannot. But this is fine because they already have a base armour of 9 and good stats across the board, honestly. In fact, I think in terms of only costing 650, the Guards of Osgiliath might be one of the most cost-effective pikes in the game. This does come, however, with its own caveat, of course, in the sense that you cannot mass the Guards of Osgiliath up quite as much as other units, such as the Uruk-hai pikes, which are more expensive. I think you can only have 2 before the cost is increased. Now, however, we shall move on, back here, to the Citadel Guardsmen, which are, of course, essentially the big brother to the standard Gondor spearmen. They have slightly more ornate armour, they have their black capes, but they are still spears at their core. But obviously they have much better stats, including their total defence, a significantly higher total defence of 28, and most of that comes from a significantly higher skill, a slightly higher shield bonus, and a slightly higher armour bonus. Now obviously they have all of the same bonuses as the regular Gondorian spearmen. The most significant difference between them, however, other than the significantly higher melee skill, is the fact that the Citadel Guard are effective against armour. They are one of the very few higher tier spears in the game which can boast having that AP. It is one of Gondor's main features. Any heavily armoured cavalry that gets caught in their web tends to die off very, very quickly, and the Citadel Guard are a big part of that, and obviously they can be very effective in siege battles as well. Another unit which finds itself on this row are the Caer Andros Swordmasters, another one of the Gondorian units which can be used aggressively. Contrary to the Axemen of Lasarnak, however, they are not AP, which could be a bit of a problem against heavily armoured factions. However, they are a human swordmaster unit, which means they have much higher skill. They also have slightly higher armour. You know, you have to upgrade the Axemen of Lasarnak all the way to have a comparable armour to the Caer Andros Swordmasters. But this unit is going to be much more at home fighting against higher tier units. So, you know, it's one of the few units, for example, which could go toe to toe with some of the basic elven infantry. They do cost 850, which is not a small amount of money, however. They can be useful, but they are a little bit more niche than the Axemen of Lasarnak, just because they are a little bit more expensive, but I really like their look. I like the Zweihanders that they use. However, when it comes to just an all-around effective unit that Gondor have available to them, I think the Fountain Guard are probably the best unit they have in their entire roster. They do rely on these guys quite a lot. They are a two-handed spear unit. They are also effective against armour, so just like the Citadel Guard, it plays into that role, which means they can absolutely massacre cavalry if it stays too close to them. But also they can form a very effective front line. It's very, very difficult to bring down the Fountain Guard from the front. One of the things you can do, of course, is they don't have a shield and they only have 1 hit point, so you can skirmish them from a distance, even if their armour value is pretty high. But yeah, a melee against the Fountain Guard rarely goes well for the opponent, especially seeing as their defensive skill is not bad either, so it's not as if it's just going to be sort of basic, heavily armoured units that they can take on. They can really go toe-to-toe with just about anything. Of course they will lose, but they will exact a pretty bloody harvest on just about any unit they come in contact with. And then Moving on, we have the shielded version, the Nimlothian Honor Guard, previously called the Shielded Fountain Guard, of course. Here we get back into the units which are more intended to be a general's bodyguard unit, because whereas you can have 2 Fountain Guard, you can only have 1 of these Honor Guards, and obviously they have fantastic stats all around, and unlike the unshielded variant, which can be skirmished from a distance pretty efficiently, this is a unit that has 2 hit points and has a shield value of 11, so very, very difficult to bring down the Nimlothian Honor Guard. Honestly, it's my favourite of the Gondorian General's Bodyguards, I think. They did actually have a cost increase because of this, I think, because most spear units will cost 1100, but because of their effectiveness against armour and just their all-around tankiness, the Nimlothian Honor Guard will run you 1200. However, it's not the only choice. For example, if you're facing off against a more infantry-heavy build in which you want to be a bit more defensive, you might want to punt for the Wardens of the White Tower, which cost 100 more, but they are going to be a little bit more effective at mowing their way through infantry in the long run. Overall, they have higher defense values as well. Yes, they do have higher defense values. I didn't want to make myself look like a complete fool there. That's Fountain Guard. But, however, they do have a fantastic defensive skill. Obviously, a hit point value of 2 as well. But really, obviously, the Wardens of the White Tower are basically the quintessential human sword and board unit. We've already seen kind of this line of thinking in the Carmel's Chosen, but this is Gondor's bread and butter. So Gondor are going to be more effective at this sort of thing. And so the Wardens of the White Tower are the better unit in this situation. Can do skill trom as well as most General's Bodyguard units can. And then finally, if you want to be a little bit more aggressive against an enemy infantry heavy build, you might want to go for the LSR's Vanguard, which has got Aragorn in its unit. The coronated Aragorn anyway. This too is a unit that costs 1300, and obviously lower defense values across the board because they don't have a shield mainly. Their skill and armour is still on par with the 2 units we just seen, but obviously they make up for this by having a significantly higher attack. They will stomp their way through enemy lower tiers, and they will be able to go toe to toe with most other 2-handed swordsmen in the game as well. They do lose out, I think, to the Temple Executioners and the Haven Guard, but few other 2-handed sword units will be able to go toe to toe with them. Obviously, you do need to support all of these units, really. The Nimlothian Honor Guard can hold out a little longer because they have more men in the unit, but all of these elites do still need a bit of supporting. But if you put them in the centre of your line of heavily armoured Gondorians, they will tie things together quite nicely because all of them can, of course, inspire, and several of them can frighten. But now we'll move on to the siege, cavalry and archers that Gondor can bring to the field. So in an interesting turn of events, I can't actually fit all of the units onto this battle, but for here just know that the ballista and catapultologists are standard for the Gondor, but what they do have, which is somewhat worth mentioning, but most people will know this, is that they do have a trebuchet. All of the Númenórean inheritor factions get a trebuchet, with the exception of Umbar, because they're on the evil side, I think. But the trebuchet is, of course, something which Gondor can leverage against their enemies. It's very expensive, but in certain situations can also be very useful, potentially extreme damage, but also wildly inaccurate because of the extreme range it also operates at under normal circumstances. But now, of course, we'll move on to the archers, where things get a little bit more interesting. And starting off with the basic militia archer, we of course have the Ramus Ekor garrison archers, which are honestly one of the most cost-effective militia archers in the game, if only because they are so difficult to bring down with other lower tier archers. If you have a look, obviously their missile attack is only 4, as you might expect from an archer like this, but they have a shield value of 3, an armor value of 5. Honestly, these defensive values stand them in pretty good stead for their relatively low outlay at 475. It's exactly the sort of thing which Gondor can bring to the field, and generally speaking, this is how Gondor will go about their business in terms of a skirmish fight. They will just simply try and outlast the opponent with their superior armor and shield values, and just sort of pepper them down over a long period of time, as I have said with Umbar several times. And of course, if that wasn't enough, the Ramus Ekor garrison also have the same armour upgrade, although it's a little bit less apparent in the archer unit, I must say, than it is in the infantry unit, because they don't seem to have the chainmail coats that the infantry upgrade seems to bestow upon them. But looking back into the main line of Gondorian archers, we start off with the Gondor archers, which are, of course, very similar to something like the Belagair archers from Umbar. They have a relatively low missile attack at 5, considering most basic archers of this sort of value. You can see missile attacks of 6 when you get into the likes of the Elven archers, but when it comes to the humans, you'll generally see a missile attack of 5. But the Gondorians, of course, have got decent defensive values, and just like the standard Gondor infantry units, the archers have also got 2 level of armour upgrades, which I'm sure you know the drill by now. The first level has got the slightly increased armour, and then the second level has got the full plate. And when you come up against the full plate Gondor archers, you know your opponent is going to be intent on simply outlasting you. Very, very difficult to skirmish with these guys cost effectively. Some factions can do it, but then it turns into a little bit more like a game of Napoleon Total War if you try and go about it like that. So generally speaking, being aggressive against Gondor might be a necessity for you if your opponent decides to go skirmish heavy, as they might be. It's definitely a very valid strategy, even against someone like the elves. Gondor do have some close range skirmishers, however, including the Pelagia Marines, which are the only javelin unit in Gondor's roster, and as javelins they're fairly average. They have a bonus against cavalry, they're effective against armour. Missile attack of 8, but that is armour piercing damage, missile damage of 8. And of course this just kind of adds to the danger that is present when you're using cavalry against Gondor, because while you can use it to great effect against Gondor, if you get it caught for any length of time, it's not only that infantry which is going to be targeting them down, but you often have Pelagia Marines in there as well, throwing their armour-piercing missiles, and of course this can apply to infantry as well. They have a decent shield value, but their armour is a little bit lacking, so like most javelins, they can be skirmished down, and often they will be, unless you keep them back for the later game. Moving back, however, to some of their more specialised archers, we have the first of 2 ranger units that Gondor can field, and Gondor are somewhat unique in that aspect. There are other factions which can field 2 rangers, but Gondor, they have the Athelian Rangers, which are of course kind of the equivalent to the Dunedain Rangers. They have been in the game since vanilla after all, do largely the same thing. Their body piercing is very lethal, of course. They have the same missile attack as the Gondor archers, but it is body piercing, of course. You can only bring one of these, and they do cost 850 though. And the same thing applies to the Athelian Rangers that applies to most Rangers. They are woeful in a skirmish fight because of their almost complete lack of armour and a low shield value, but of course they make up for this by being able to deal huge amounts of damage potentially. Contrary to this, we have the Caer Andros Marksmen, which are essentially Gondor archers on steroids. They have an armor value of 11, which is enormous. They don't have any shield values, but again, it's essentially just a unit to tie your skirmish line together if that's the way you want to do things. 900 is quite a lot for Caer Andros Marksmen, but oftentimes they can be worth it. Similar situation here as the Citadel Guard and Gondor Spearmen sort of comparison goes. They are just better versions in every way. There are slightly fewer of them, but it's you pay for quality. And then we move on to another unit which can have 2 levels of armour upgrades, the Veterans of Osgiliath. And these guys can inspire nearby troops, and also I think their unique feature is they have slightly higher range than the other archers in the Gondor roster, and of course they have a decent shield value of 4, and when they're in melee they can make decent makeshift line infantry. It's not quite as good as it used to be in one of the previous patches where they had multiple HP, but still very, very decent nonetheless. Obviously here we have the standard variant where you've got eye patches, sort of bloody tunics as well. The second level, which sort of replaces this with some more armour, reminiscent of the Caer Andros Blade Masses, and then finally, the final variant. You can see this is very similar to the final upgrade to the Axemen of the Sarnak. Full plate, obviously going to be very, very difficult to skirmish down. Most of these Gondor archers, other than the Rangers, can be very, very difficult to kill at range. Even in melee, some of them. But back here we have a somewhat unique case in the Wardens of Minas Ithil. You can see actually if we just get a look, Faramir is over there. Boromir was in the Veterans of Osgiliath as well. But the Wardens of Minas Ithil are technically speaking, a General's Bodyguard unit, which can be used, well, a Ranger General's Bodyguard unit. They cost 1200 of course. Now, they have a missile attack of 6, and they have, I think, more ammunition than standard Rangers. Definitely a unit, I think, which you're more likely to see in a siege than on an open field. And also a unit that you're unlikely to see housing the General, if only because having the General in a unit means they can't hide, which completely negates the fact that these Rangers can hide anywhere. But nonetheless, definitely going to be a siege-focused unit, I think, because if they're on an open field, they can be very easily skirmished down, even with the 2 hit points, because there are only 51 of them. And also a very, very risky pick in an open field. Whereas in a defensive siege, you can sequester them away in the back, and then if you reveal them in the late game, your opponent's heart is sure to sink. Multiple HP means they're not half bad in melee either once they run out of ammunition. And then the final stretch, we have the Gondorian cavalry line. Starting off with the Ramus Ekor Garrison Cavalry, of course, as the militia cavalry. Now Gondor's cavalry is entirely made up of lancers, which means they can be very potent off the charge. But of course this does leave them somewhat vulnerable in terms of a melee fight, and most people think that the Gondorian cavalry is not that great. It can be good, just as long as you keep it away from sustained fights with other cavalry, particularly of, wargs or Khand or someone similar like that. And the Ramus Ekor Garrison Cavalry, obviously very similar to other militia cavalry in the game. Decent charge, well, a charge bonus of 5, but it is an armour piercing charge bonus of 5. Which can make all the difference against line infantry, and hammer and anvil is going to be the main purpose of this, other than saturating a cavalry fight, which is a somewhat risky move. We also have this over here, which is the upgraded armour variant, but it doesn't seem like this one gets the chainmail coats either, which is a bit of a shame. Moving on, however, starting off with the Gondor cavalry, I've actually only brought 2 of the upgraded armour models, but the same situation applies here, obviously. The basic mail then transitions into this with the slightly more armour, and then transitions into this over here with the full plate. And with the full plate, interestingly enough, the Gondor cavalry is actually pretty resilient to arrows in spite of not having a shield. Now, lower tier arrows, that is. And against cavalry which is not armour piercing in melee, the Gondor cavalry could also hold its own reasonably well. The problem comes, obviously, if there is such a unit on the field where the Gondor cavalry will fall down. But their charge bonus is also greater at 10, and that is also armour piercing. Moving on to the Pineth Gelin cavalry. This is again just the slightly higher tier variant of the Gondor cavalry, basically. They've got decent armour value, well, lesser armour values, but a shield as well as decent shield value at that. And also they have more melee skill as well, which is always good. It means they can actually hold themselves together a little bit better in a sustained melee fight, and they apparently have an upgraded armour model, which is fairly new, I think. Indeed, they have these shoulder pauldrons over here, which is decent to see, with their partisan spears. And then finally we have one unit which can hold itself together in melee with other cavalry, the Gandalf's Retinue Bodyguard. This does come with its own caveat, of course, that it cannot hold itself in melee together against knight units, but as a multiple HP Lancer it does reasonably well at everything else. And actually, only 1150 means it's cheaper than most other multiple HP Lancer units as well, despite being arguably more effective than most. Its total defense is huge, mainly because of its armor and shield values. Its defensive skill is also decent as well. And obviously as a General's Bodyguard unit, it will inspire, and it will frighten nearby enemy infantry. It's basically the quintessential multiple HP Lancer in many ways. But let's go back to the army selection screen and we'll talk about what I think about Gondor. So as I'm sure you've heard me say before, Gondor is a very defensive faction by nature. They are very much focused around their ability to outlast their opponent at range and in melee through sheer attrition. Now, it's not quite as extreme as someone like Khazad-dûm, for example, who basically on an open field have got no choice but to be defensive the vast majority of the time. Gondor do have some aggressive options which can be utilised, especially if you're in a team-based battle. Gondor can then switch their tactics around rather dramatically. But if you're talking about a 1v1 situation with standard funds, then most of the time you're going to be seeing the Gondorians rely on you coming to them, utilising their shield and armour values to sort of make it so a skirmish is going to be not all that appealing to you, because you're not really going to get a great deal of value for money off of it, and using their armour-piercing pole arms to keep enemy cavalry at bay. You know, their own cavalry can be used aggressively as well, or it can be used to screen out enemy cavalry, but generally speaking, the Gondorian cavalry is most at home when it's charging into enemy infantry, not when it's in a sustained fight with other cavalry. The Pineth Gelin cavalry can do this with their slightly higher skill values than the more basic cavalry, but they're not going to be cost effective at doing this. They cost 750, which is more than some of the standard melee cavalry, and they will still lose that fight, even if they don't go down without a fight. Still, Gondor are, you know, most of Gondor's cavalry needs are satisfied by Dol Amroth in the lore, and this does show in their roster. And ultimately, while I do think Gondor are very viable with how many tools they have, in particular their Fountain Guard variants are extremely powerful, something like the Citadel Guard, and how cost effective their front line can be. If you're a player with a more defensive mindset, then Gondor are going to suit you very much, arguably more so than Khazad-dûm, because they are a little bit more versatile in how they can approach things. There's a little bit more forgiveness with how you play Gondor rather than Khazad-dûm. However, for me, personally, they never have quite recovered from the loss of their Dol Amroth units. You know, Gondor in the vanilla version of the game were my personal favourites. They have never really been that in Reforged because of how different they've been ever since Dol Amroth have split off from them. But to many people they are still a very effective faction, and I have heard detractors say that you don't see Gondor win all that often, but that's mainly because people often put Gondor up against insurmountable odds that it's very unlikely they will win, which is very lore appropriate in many ways. But yeah, I mean, if you like to play defensively, if you like to outlast your opponent, and if you like to really be solid and sure of yourself in terms of a skirmish fight and in terms of warding off enemy cavalry with armour-piercing pole arms and just letting your opponent throw themselves against you and slowly but surely exhaust themselves and eventually be defeated, then Gondor are going to definitely appeal to your playstyle. For me, that's not really how I like to do things most of the time, but I can see why it's very appealing. I mean, I like Umbar, and Umbar are not all that dissimilar to Gondor at the end of the day. So maybe I really should be giving Gondor a little bit more credit in terms of my own in terms of how I like to do things, but we'll see. I mean, I should probably play Gondor a little bit more often. I should probably play in general a little bit more often, to be honest with you. But yeah, this has been Gondor, and next up, I think, depending on whether or not I do this when the hotfix comes out or not, will either be Imladris or Mirkwood. So I hope I'll see you for that.